On June 3, 1965, a 25-year-old man named Ed Dwight sat closer to space than almost anyone in America. He was a decorated Air Force pilot, selected by President John F. Kennedy as the first black astronaut candidate in the United States. Newspapers photographed him smiling in uniform. His name was presented as history in motion. He had done everything that should have moved him forward: discipline, talent, sacrifice, excellence under pressure. And still, he never reached orbit. For years, Dwight trained inside a machine designed to test human limits. Centrifuges crushed his body under artificial gravity. Isolation chambers deprived him of stimulation. Simulations forced instant decisions under life-threatening scenarios. But none of those tests became the thing that stopped him. What stopped him was something less visible and far more common. Not a lack of competence. Not an absence of opportunity. Not even fear in its cinematic form.
No explosión.
No public collapse.
No dramatic catastrophe.
Instead, hesitation, politics, delay, invisible obstruction, prolonged uncertainty. Endless moments where action was technically possible, but psychologically suffocated by forces harder to name. Dwight later described existing in a constant atmosphere of pressure and ambiguity, always close enough to the future to see it, never close enough to fully enter it. This is the kind of paralysis most people never recognize in themselves. Not because they are incapable of movement, but because their life becomes crowded with almost actions. Almost saying what needs to be said. Almost leaving what should have ended years ago. Almost becoming someone else. There is a specific pain in standing near the door of your own next life while remaining motionless. Not because the door is locked, but because something inside you keeps treating movement itself as the threat. And the most dangerous part is how normal that begins to feel. Avoidance rarely announces itself as destruction. It almost never arrives looking dangerous. It arrives disguised as logic. Tomorrow feels more strategic than today. Waiting feels responsible. Silence feels mature. Delaying a confrontation feels like emotional control. Postponing a decision feels like collecting more information. From the outside, nothing appears broken. Your routines remain functional. You still answer messages. You still go to work. You still smile when required. You still tell yourself you are thinking carefully. But beneath this surface, something microscopic is being altered every time you retreat. Not your schedule, your identity. Every avoided phone call teaches your nervous system a lesson. Every delayed boundary reinforces an instruction. Every challenge you keep postponing writes evidence into your self-image. The lesson is brutally simple. You must not be someone who can handle this. Otherwise, you would have acted. This is how self-doubt is not merely felt, it is manufactured. Not through one catastrophic failure, but through thousands of silent negotiations where comfort wins and your future loses by fractions. No one sees these moments. There is no audience for the conversation you never initiate. No witness to the project you never begin. No ceremony marking the version of you that quietly died because you kept postponing discomfort. And yet, these invisible moments accumulate with mathematical precision. A life can slowly become shaped not by what happened to you, but by what you continuously refuse to face. Most people believe confidence disappears first, and avoidance follows. But reality is often crueler. Avoidance comes first, and then confidence begins to rot underneath it. There is something profoundly deceptive about fear. People imagine fear as a wall, solid, obvious, confrontational. But much of the time, fear behaves more like architecture. It redesigns your internal map. Without asking permission, it quietly changes what feels available to you. A conversation that was once possible now feels loaded with unbearable consequences. A decision that could have been made in one afternoon suddenly expands into weeks, months, sometimes years of internal negotiation. Nothing external may have changed. Only your relationship to discomfort. This is where a strange inversion begins. The very actions most capable of strengthening you start feeling like threats to your stability. Growth begins to look reckless. Honesty begins to look dangerous. Boundaries begin to feel cruel. Ambition begins to feel exhausting. and retreat begins to feel wise. This reversal is so subtle that many people build entire lives around it without noticing. They call it being careful, being realistic, being patient. But beneath those labels, a quieter truth is operating. Their nervous system has started prioritizing emotional immediate relief over long-term psychological freedom. What you are about to confront is not simply a problem of discipline, motivation, or courage. It is far more intimate, a hidden mechanism shaping how you interpret discomfort, challenge, and your own capacity to withstand both. And once you see it clearly, many of the decisions you thought were rational will begin to look disturbingly different. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because your mind may have been protecting you from the very experiences required to trust yourself again. Inside a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman was trying to understand something deceptively simple: what happens when an organism learns that suffering cannot be controlled. The setup was clinical, mechanical, emotionally sterile. Dogs were placed inside harnesses that restrained movement. A sound was played, then an electric shock followed. In some conditions, the animals could stop the discomfort by pressing a panel with their nose. Their action mattered. Cause and effect remained intact. But in another condition, a different group experienced something far more psychologically corrosive. No matter what they did, the shock continued. They could move, struggle, tense, vocalize, attempt resistance. None of it changed the outcome. Their behavior had been disconnected from consequence. This detail is everything. Pain alone was not the defining variable. Uncontrollable pain was. At first, the dogs reacted with energy. They fought against the harness. Their bodies resisted with the instinctive urgency of living systems attempting to restore order. But repeated failure began producing something measurable. Their movements slowed. Resistance weakened. Attempts became shorter, less frequent, less committed. It was not fatigue in the ordinary sense. Something deeper was being conditioned. An internal recalibration. A new prediction about reality itself. The environment was teaching a brutal lesson. Your actions do not matter. This is the moment most people misunderstand about avoidance. Avoidance does not begin as cowardice. It often begins as adaptation, a rational response to repeated experiences where effort appears disconnected from outcome. The nervous system is not making a moral decision. It is learning a rule. And once that rule is installed, something profoundly dangerous begins. Not merely fear of pain, but doubt in the usefulness of trying at all. After this conditioning phase, the experiment changed. The animals were moved into what researchers called a shuttle box, a simple apparatus divided by a low barrier. One side of the box delivered electric shocks through the floor. The other side was safe. Escape was no longer theoretical. It was physically available. The barrier was low enough to jump over with minimal effort. No complex reasoning was required.
No impossible obstacle existed.
The route to relief was visible, immediate, and achievable. And yet something extraordinary happened. Dogs that had previously learned control adapted quickly. When the shock began, they crossed the barrier and escaped. But many of the dogs previously exposed to uncontrollable shocks did something that has since become one of the most haunting observations in behavioral psychology. They did not jump. Not because they were restrained. Not because they were incapable. Not because the exit was hidden. They simply remained where they were. Some lay down. Some whimpered. Some passively endured discomfort while an available path to safety sat inches away. This is the image that transformed the experiment from a behavioral curiosity into a psychological mirror. Freedom had been restored, but the belief in freedom had not. This distinction is devastating. A human being can exist in a nearly identical condition. The relationship can be left. The boundary can be spoken. The project can begin. The apology can be requested. The resignation letter can be written. The door can be opened. And still nothing happens. Because after enough experiences where action seemed useless, the body no longer waits for proof. It starts predicting futility automatically. The cage does not always need walls. Sometimes all it needs is a mind that has concluded escape is no longer worth attempting. This was not merely an observation about animals. It forced a more uncomfortable question. How many forms of passivity are actually learned, not inherited, not chosen in the simplistic way people often imagine? Learned. Repeated exposure to situations where speaking changed nothing, where asking was ignored, where trying produced humiliation, where effort met indifference, where vulnerability was punished, a child repeatedly dismissed, an employee chronically overlooked, partner constantly invalidated, a person whose attempts to improve, repair, negotiate, or protect themselves are met again and again with emotional or structural futility. The mind records patterns, not opinions, patterns, and from those patterns it constructs expectations. This is where avoidance becomes less about a single event and more about an operating system. A hidden logic begins running underneath behavior. Do not risk. Do not expose yourself. Do not attempt what may fail. Preserve energy. Minimize damage. Stay still. From the outside, this can look like procrastination, indecision, passivity, low ambition, emotional withdrawal. But internally, something else may be occurring. A nervous system economizing against anticipated defeat. This is what makes repeated avoidance so psychologically expensive. Every retreat feels relieving in the short term, but it also quietly confirms the original prediction. Good thing you did not try. Probably would not have worked anyway. This is how behavior starts manufacturing belief. Not through philosophy, through repetition. And once your actions begin proving your own helplessness back to you, the story hardens. Not as a thought, as identity. In a quiet room at Stanford University during the late 1960s and early 1970s, psychologist Walter Mischel constructed an experiment that appeared almost absurdly innocent. A child was seated alone at a small table. In front of them sat a single marshmallow. Sometimes it was replaced with a cookie or pretzel, depending on the child's preference. The reward itself was not the point. The real subject under examination was psychological tension. The child was given a simple choice: eat the treat immediately, or wait. If they could remain alone without consuming it until the researcher returned, they would receive a second reward. 2 instead of 1. A larger future in exchange for tolerating a smaller present discomfort. The setup was elegant because it stripped away complexity. No abstract moral language.
No filosofique el debate.
Just one nervous system negotiating with desire. One immediate impulse confronting a delayed benefit. What looked like a trivial decision was actually a compressed model of human conflict. Immediate emotional relief versus future gain. The child sat in silence while the clock became psychological pressure. Seconds expanded. Attention intensified craving. The reward was visible, tangible, fragrant, reachable. This matters. The discomfort was not dramatic. No threat, no pain.
No catastrophe.
Only the low-grade friction of not immediately satisfying an impulse. And yet, for many children, this was enough to create visible internal struggle. Some covered their eyes. Some turned their bodies away. Some touched the table, sang to themselves, hid under their hands, or stared at the ceiling as if physically negotiating with temptation. This was not merely about candy. It was a confrontation with something far more universal. The ability to remain inside temporary discomfort without escaping it at the first available opportunity. What made the experiment so psychologically revealing was not which children waited. It was how they managed to wait. The children who resisted were rarely relying on brute force alone. They did not simply stare directly at temptation and overpower themselves through raw will. Many instinctively altered their relationship to the stimulus. They distracted themselves. They transformed the object mentally. Some imagined the marshmallow as a cloud, a picture, an abstract shape, something less emotionally loaded than food. This subtle mechanism became one of the experiment's most important findings. Self-control was not merely suppression. It was attentional strategy, a reorganization of focus. This distinction is critical. Most people imagine discipline as a violent internal war, a stronger self strangling a weaker self into obedience. But the children who tolerated waiting most effectively often did something more intelligent. They reduced exposure to temptation psychologically. They changed what occupied consciousness. This is not a small detail, because much of avoidance follows the opposite pattern. Attention locks onto the immediate discomfort, the awkwardness of the conversation, the uncertainty of the decision, the emotional friction of beginning, the temporary embarrassment of trying. And once attention fixates there, relief becomes disproportionately attractive. The short-term escape begins feeling necessary, not because the long-term goal disappeared, but because the immediate discomfort has consumed perceptual space. The marshmallow experiment exposed something almost embarrassingly human. Many choices that shape an entire life are not lost because the future lacks value. They are lost because the present feels too psychologically loud. Not catastrophic, just loud enough to interrupt long-term reasoning. And that is often all it takes. Years later, Michel and colleagues followed many of these children into adolescence and adulthood. The early reports became culturally famous. Children who waited longer appeared, on average, to show stronger academic outcomes, better frustration tolerance, and more effective coping strategies later in life. These findings were widely interpreted as evidence that delayed gratification predicted future success. The conclusion was seductive, simple, almost mythological. Resist the small pleasure now, receive the larger reward later. But the deeper lesson was never about desert. It was about temporal negotiation, the human ability to remain loyal to a future self while the present self demands immediate resolution. This conflict governs far more than food. It governs spending, addiction, relationships, habits, health, honesty, career decisions, conflict avoidance, and emotional regulation. The architecture is identical. A short-term reduction in discomfort is offered. The future quietly submits the bill. This is the hidden economy most people underestimate. Immediate relief feels cheap, almost free. You avoid the message. You delay the decision. You remain silent one more day. You promise yourself you will handle it later. The nervous system receives what it wanted, reduction of friction. But something else has been purchased in exchange. A reinforcement, a subtle training session. You have just taught yourself which master you obey when tension appears. The future or the urge to immediately neutralize discomfort. And this lesson compounds, not dramatically, incrementally, one seemingly insignificant surrender at a time. There is a reason immediate relief is so persuasive. Produces certainty. The discomfort ends. The tension decreases. The body receives closure. And the brain registers this as successful problem solving. This is what makes short-term escape so difficult to resist. Its reward is immediate, measurable, emotionally tangible. The cost is delayed, abstract, and easy to psychologically discount. No visible punishment arrives the moment you choose relief. Nothing collapses because you avoided one uncomfortable moment, which, by 1913, Theodore Roosevelt had already lived several lifetimes in one. He had been President of the United States, a war hero, a reformer, a public force of almost theatrical intensity. He had occupied the center of power, conflict, and history with such relentless momentum that stillness itself had likely become intolerable. And then, abruptly, that phase ended. He lost the 1912 presidential election after running as a Progressive Party candidate against Woodrow Wilson and splitting the Republican vote with William Howard Taft. For most men, this would have been enough to justify retreat. Withdrawal, a quieter existence built around reputation, reflection, and the comfortable repetition of past achievements. Roosevelt chose something else. He accepted an invitation to travel to South America, initially for lectures and scientific exploration. But the journey escalated into something far less ceremonial. An expedition to chart an unmapped tributary of the Amazon then known as the River of Doubt. This was not recreational adventure. It was a hazardous geographic undertaking through one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Dense jungle, disease,
Instable terrain,
unknown waterways, hostile insects, dangerous currents, starvation risk, and logistical uncertainty. He was 55 years old, already physically worn from years of injury, exertion, and political combat. There was no strategic necessity for this. No office to win, no campaign to salvage, no public obligation forcing him forward. Only a decision: remain psychologically alive through uncertainty, or begin the quieter death of irrelevance. This distinction matters, because comfort does not merely preserve you. Under certain conditions, it begins erasing you, especially after you have built an identity around motion, challenge, and confrontation. For some people, inaction is not rest. It is erosion. The river of doubt was not simply remote. It was largely unknown to the outside world. The expedition descended a dangerous river system with unreliable maps, inadequate supplies, and limited certainty about what waited ahead. The environment stripped away abstraction. There was no room for symbolic courage here, only practical endurance. Canoes were damaged or lost. Rapids destroyed equipment. Food shortages intensified pressure. Navigation errors compounded risk. The jungle itself functioned like a slow machine of attrition. Humidity, insects, exhaustion, infection, and physical depletion accumulated daily. Every mile forward had to be extracted from resistance. Roosevelt entered the expedition carrying prior injuries, including the long-term physical consequences of earlier accidents and strain. Then conditions worsened. He injured his leg after slicing it on a canoe while entering the river. The wound became infected. Soon he developed a serious fever. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly. By multiple historical accounts, Roosevelt became so ill that he believed he was endangering the expedition. He reportedly suggested that his companions leave him behind to die so the group could continue with fewer burdens. This was not rhetorical drama. It was a practical recognition of how compromised he had become. A former president, one of the most powerful men in the world, reduced to biological fragility inside indifferent wilderness. This is what confrontation with uncertainty actually looks like. Not glamorous bravery, not cinematic triumph, degradation, exposure, the collapse of control. And still, he had chosen this, not because suffering was desirable, but because there are forms of psychological decay that arrive when challenge disappears. And for some people, that decay feels more intolerable than danger itself. Long before this expedition, Roosevelt had articulated a philosophy that would become inseparable from his public identity. In 1910, during a speech at the Sorbonne in Paris, he delivered what later became known as the man in the arena. The passage is often quoted, usually reduced to motivational decoration. But stripped of sentimentality, its meaning is harsher than people remember. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, not the observer, not the critic, not the analyst of risk from a protected distance. The one physically exposed, marred by effort, bloodied by error. Roosevelt did not merely write these ideas. He operationalized them. He repeatedly placed himself in conditions where failure, pain, humiliation, and uncertainty remained possible. This is what made the Amazon expedition psychologically coherent. It was not a random act of adventure. It was identity maintenance, a refusal to let comfort rewrite who he believed himself to be. This distinction is uncomfortable because it reveals something many people quietly fear. Identity is not maintained through thought alone. You cannot endlessly imagine yourself as courageous while repeatedly behaving as someone organized around avoidance. Eventually, behavior begins overruling narrative. Action edits self-concept with brutal honesty. This is why inaction damages more than progress, contaminates identity. Each avoided challenge introduces friction between self-image and evidence. You say you are capable. Your behavior submits contradictory data. And over time, the contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Not because anyone else notices, but because you do. And self-respect begins corroding in private. At approximately 3:20 a.m. on March 13, 1964, Catherine Kitty Genovese was returning home to her apartment in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York. She parked her car and began walking toward her building. Then she was attacked. The assailant, Winston Moseley, stabbed her outside. Genovese screamed. According to documented accounts, her cries included calls for help. Lights turned on in nearby apartment windows. At least some residents became aware that something alarming was happening below. The attacker fled temporarily after being interrupted. For a moment, the event appeared interrupted. The threat seemed paused. But it was not over. Moseley later returned, found Genovese again, and attacked her a second time in a nearby vestibule, ultimately killing her. The case became nationally infamous after a New York Times article reported that 38 witnesses had observed the attack or its aftermath without intervening or contacting police. Later investigations complicated parts of this reporting, showing that the number and level of awareness had been overstated or simplified. Not every witness understood the severity of what was occurring. Not everyone observed the full event. The mythology exceeded the literal facts. But the psychological impact remained. A deeply disturbing question had entered public consciousness. How can multiple people be near visible human crisis, and yet no immediate decisive intervention occurs? This question was larger than crime. It touched something psychologically uncomfortable about collective hesitation. Not monstrous indifference, something subtler. Ambiguity, delay, mutual observation. A moment where action is possible, necessary, even obvious in retrospect, and still somehow suspended. This is what makes the case endure in public memory. Not because evil was unusually dramatic, but because passivity appeared horrifyingly ordinary. Social psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley became fascinated by the implications of the Genovese case. Not by criminal pathology, by hesitation. They wanted to understand what happens inside a mind when responsibility is psychologically shared. In 1968, they conducted a series of experiments that would become foundational to social psychology. One study was deceptively simple. Participants believed they were taking part in a discussion over intercom with other individuals located in separate rooms. In reality, some of these participants were alone, while others believed multiple people were simultaneously listening. During the session, one voice, actually pre-recorded, appeared to begin having what sounded like a seizure. The voice expressed distress. Breathing became labored. Words fragmented. Then came silence. The situation was designed to create perceived urgency. Someone seemed to need immediate help. The results were unsettling. Participants who believed they were the only witness often responded rapidly. But when participants believed several others were also present, intervention rates slowed dramatically. Many hesitated. Some delayed long enough that the contrast became statistically meaningful. This was not because they lacked comprehension. They heard the same event, interpreted the same distress. What changed was internal ownership. When responsibility is fully yours, action becomes clearer. When responsibility is diffused across multiple minds, uncertainty enters. Should I act? Has someone else already done something? Am I overreacting? Do others interpret this the same way? This cognitive hesitation is often invisible from the outside. But internally, it creates paralysis through distributed accountability. Action does not feel denied, only delayed. And delay is often all avoidance needs to survive. This mechanism is not confined to emergencies. It scales quietly into ordinary life. Responsibility can become psychologically diluted even when no crowd exists. A difficult conversation is postponed because the other person should probably initiate it too. A failing relationship remains unresolved because both individuals silently wait for the other to address what is obvious. A dysfunctional workplace continues unchanged because everyone privately assumes someone more qualified will eventually intervene. A personal crisis deepens while a person waits for external permission. Better timing, clearer certainty, stronger motivation. The architecture is the same. Action becomes suspended inside shared ambiguity. This is what makes responsibility diffusion so personally dangerous. It does not require literal bystanders. Only internal fragmentation. One part of you recognizes what needs to happen. Another part delays ownership. Not denial, deferral. A psychological handoff to an undefined future agent. Someone should handle this. Later, when conditions are cleaner, when emotions are calmer, when confidence is higher, when consequences are easier to manage. But responsibility rarely evaporates. It accumulates. The cost of inaction compounds quietly in the background while the mind negotiates with itself. This is how avoidance often disguises itself. Not as refusal, as procedural delay, as temporary postponement with no declared endpoint. Nothing has been rejected, only deferred into a future that may never psychologically arrive. And because the language sounds rational, the mechanism often escapes detection entirely. You are not saying no. You are simply never fully saying yes. There is a reason avoidance feels intelligent in the moment. It works, at least temporarily. The tension decreases. The pulse slows. The uncomfortable anticipation dissolves. The feared event is postponed, escaped, or never encountered at all. Subjectively, this feels like success. Problem was neutralized. Distress was reduced. Internal equilibrium was restored. This immediate relief is what made psychologist Hobart Mohrer's work so psychologically important. In 1947, Mohrer formalized what became known as the two-factor theory of avoidance learning. His framework integrated two mechanisms. First, classical conditioning. A neutral stimulus becomes associated with something aversive. An originally harmless cue acquires emotional charge. Second, operant conditioning. A behavior that reduces distress becomes reinforced. Not because it creates growth, because it creates relief. This distinction is foundational. Avoidance is not maintained primarily by logic. It is maintained by emotional reward. The organism learns a devastatingly efficient lesson. When this cue appears, escape. Anxiety drops. Behavior reinforced. Repeat. The loop becomes elegant in its brutality. Fear generates discomfort. Avoidance removes discomfort. Removal feels rewarding. Reward strengthens avoidance. And the cycle stabilizes itself. No external enemy is required. The system self-perpetuates internally. This is what makes avoidance so psychologically adhesive. It masquerades as problem-solving. You leave the stressful environment. You avoid the conversation. You do not press send. You decline the opportunity. Immediately, your body thanks you. Relief floods in like confirmation. See? That was the right move. But the nervous system is learning something much more consequential than temporary comfort. It is being trained to associate retreat with safety and approach with threat. This is the hidden trap. Because avoidance does reduce anxiety, temporarily, and that temporary reduction is enough to teach the brain that avoidance is useful. The relief is real. This is what makes the mechanism so persuasive. If avoidance produced only suffering, it would be easy to abandon. But it produces immediate emotional reward. And immediate rewards are neurologically persuasive. This creates a cruel paradox. The behavior that protects you from anxiety in the short term is often the same behavior preserving anxiety in the long term. By avoiding the feared situation, you never update the prediction. You never gather new evidence. The feared scenario remains psychologically unresolved, untested, unchallenged, still alive. This means the threat is not eliminated. It is preserved in conceptual amber, frozen, untouched, still carrying all its original emotional charge. The avoided email remains threatening. The avoided conversation remains threatening. The avoided decision remains threatening. Not because these things are objectively growing more dangerous, but because your relationship to them remains metabolically incomplete. You never completed the emotional cycle. No exposure.
No disconfirmación.
No corrective learning. Only postponement. This is what makes anxiety feel strangely immortal. People often believe they are reducing fear by avoiding what triggers it. But behaviorally, they are often feeding it. Not dramatically, incrementally, like paying interest on a psychological debt that never gets resolved. Every avoidance response adds another installment. The account remains open, and the mind continues charging you for something you never fully confronted. Morer's theory helps explain why avoidance tends to expand beyond its original target. Fear generalizes. A single avoided stimulus can begin contaminating adjacent experiences. What began as hesitation around one conversation becomes avoidance of multiple forms of confrontation. One postponed decision expands into chronic indecision. One emotionally difficult situation begins teaching a broader behavioral template. Better not engage. Better not risk. Better not activate discomfort. This is how lives become organized around anxiety management rather than meaningful pursuit. The objective shifts. No longer, what creates growth? Instead, what minimizes activation? This is a radically different operating principle, and it often masquerades as prudence, as carefulness, as emotional intelligence. But beneath the surface, the system may be increasingly governed by negative reinforcement, not pursuing what matters, simply escaping what activates tension. This shift is subtle enough to go unnoticed for years. A person may sincerely believe they are making rational choices, reducing drama, avoiding unnecessary conflict, being strategic. Meanwhile, their world is shrinking, not through explicit collapse, through systematic removal of psychologically demanding experiences. Less exposure, less uncertainty, less confrontation, less vulnerability, less aliveness. The nervous system feels safer. The life becomes smaller. This is the transaction avoidance rarely advertises. Immediate calm in exchange for gradual contraction. And because the exchange feels beneficial at first, many people do not realize what they are sacrificing until their range of movement has already narrowed dramatically. This is why avoidance can feel paradoxically calming and destructive at the same time. Its short-term effects are soothing. Its long-term effects are corrosive. Both are true simultaneously. And because human perception is biased toward immediate consequence, the nervous system naturally privileges what can be felt now. Relief is immediate. Cost is delayed. This asymmetry creates one of the most efficient behavioral traps in human psychology. You are rewarded first, charged later. The emotional invoice arrives gradually. Reduced confidence, increased sensitivity, more anticipatory anxiety, greater fragility around uncertainty, a stronger need for control. If avoidance teaches the nervous system that distance equals safety, then one disturbing implication immediately follows. Fear can only remain dominant if the feared object is never fully re-encountered under new conditions. This is what made the work of psychologist Mary Cover Jones so revolutionary. In 1924, Jones conducted what later became one of the earliest documented cases of exposure therapy. Her subject was a young child known as Little Peter. Peter demonstrated a fear response to several furry stimuli, including rabbits. When the rabbit was brought near him, he reacted with visible distress. Avoidance would have made intuitive sense. Remove the stimulus, reduce the fear, preserve calm. But Jones approached the problem differently. She did not attempt to eliminate Peter's fear through explanation, reassurance, or abstract reasoning. She targeted the learning structure itself. The intervention was deceptively simple. Peter was seated and given food he enjoyed. While he ate, a white rabbit was introduced into the room, but positioned at a safe distance, far enough away that Peter could tolerate its presence without becoming overwhelmed. This detail matters. The goal was not forced confrontation, not flooding, not psychological domination. It was calibrated contact, a carefully managed exposure where anxiety remained activated but tolerable. This distinction changed everything. Because the nervous system was now receiving new data. The feared object was present. Catastrophe was absent. Distress was activated. Escape did not occur. And yet, nothing unbearable happened. This is the beginning of fear revision. Not through argument, through lived contradiction. The body is forced to update what the mind has been protecting for too long. And what it often discovers is deeply destabilizing. The threat was never as absolute as the avoidance pattern suggested. The process was gradual, deliberately gradual. Across repeated sessions, the rabbit was moved incrementally closer while Peter continued engaging in a positive and regulated activity. Each exposure slightly altered the emotional equation. What had once produced fear was repeatedly paired with tolerable safety. No dramatic breakthrough was required. No singular moment of transformation, just repetition, controlled proximity, a sequence of manageable experiences strong enough to challenge prior conditioning, weak enough to remain sustainable. This is one of the most psychologically important lessons in behavior change. Transformation rarely emerges from overwhelming acts of courage. It often emerges from repeated toleration of manageable discomfort. A dosage small enough to continue, large enough to matter. This is where many people misunderstand exposure. They imagine change requires intensity, a grand confrontation, a decisive emotional victory. But nervous systems are not persuaded by declarations. They are retrained through evidence, through repetition, through surviving what was previously coded as dangerous. This is why Peter's case remains historically important. Not because a child touched a rabbit, but because it demonstrated something far more consequential. Fear is not always defeated by removing its trigger. Sometimes it is reduced precisely because the trigger remains present long enough for new learning to occur. This is profoundly counterintuitive. The very experience the nervous system labels as threatening may contain the conditions necessary for recalibration. Not all discomfort is damage. Some discomfort is information, and without contact, that information never arrives. This principle extends far beyond childhood phobias. Its architecture is universal. A feared conversation loses intensity after it is finally had. A delayed decision becomes less psychologically monstrous once made. A social fear weakens after repeated tolerated interaction. The mechanism is the same, not because external reality necessarily changed, but because the nervous system finally acquired corrective data. Prediction collided with reality, and reality was less catastrophic than anticipated. This is what avoidance prevents, not merely action, learning. When you avoid, you preserve prediction. When you engage, you expose prediction to testing. And testing is what makes revision possible. Without exposure, fear is protected from contradiction, allowed to survive in idealized form, untouched by evidence. This is why many fears become more intimidating in imagination than in experience. The absence of contact allows distortion to flourish. Distance amplifies abstraction, and abstraction is fertile ground for exaggeration. A feared event untested can become psychologically mythologized. Larger than life, larger than capacity, larger than reality. Exposure punctures mythology, not because the situation becomes pleasant, but because it becomes real, and reality is often less. There is a threshold beyond which most people assume psychological resilience must collapse. A point where external conditions become so hostile, so dehumanizing, so stripped of dignity and control, that agency itself appears impossible. Viktor Frankl was forced into precisely that territory. An Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist, Frankl was deported by the Nazis during World War II and imprisoned in multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau subcamps. His parents, brother, and pregnant wife were all lost during the Holocaust. Nearly everything recognizable as ordinary human life was systematically removed. Name replaced by number, profession erased, property confiscated, privacy destroyed, future destabilized, autonomy reduced to near nothing. This is what made Frankl's observations so psychologically disruptive. Not because he documented suffering. Many had done that. But because he examined what remained psychologically possible inside an environment seemingly engineered to annihilate meaning itself. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl described how prisoners were subjected not only to physical deprivation, but to prolonged uncertainty, humiliation, hunger, exhaustion, cold, forced labor, and the constant presence of death. Under such conditions, conventional motivation collapses. Comfort is gone. Security is gone. Predictability is gone. Even personal identity becomes threatened by total institutional domination. Frankl became intensely interested in a question more psychologically relevant than survival statistics alone. What allowed certain prisoners to maintain inner orientation despite catastrophic external conditions? His answer was not naive optimism, not denial, not emotional positivity, something far more severe, meaning, not as abstraction, as psychological structure, a reason to continue enduring present suffering, a future task, a loved one held mentally alive, an unfinished responsibility, a commitment to witnessing, remembering, or preserving something internally unconfiscated. Frankl described imagining himself lecturing after the war, mentally reconstructing the lessons he was learning inside the camps. He used anticipated future meaning as a stabilizing frame, not because fantasy removed suffering, but because orientation changes how suffering is metabolized. Pain without meaning easily mutates into despair. Pain connected to purpose becomes more psychologically containable. Still brutal, still costly, but no longer entirely chaotic. This was one of Frankl's most radical insights. Human beings can tolerate extraordinary levels of hardship when suffering is integrated into a meaningful frame. Not because pain becomes pleasant, because it becomes interpretable, psychologically organized. This does not romanticize trauma. Frankl was explicit about horror. The camps were not character-building exercises. They were atrocities. But inside atrocity, he observed a distinction with enormous implications. The final domain of human freedom may not be external circumstance. It may be the attitude adopted toward unavoidable circumstance. This is a severe claim, because it relocates a fragment of responsibility inward even under conditions where outward control is catastrophically restricted. And for many people, this is more uncomfortable than helplessness itself. This is where Frankl's observations become difficult to ignore, because they challenge a deeply comforting assumption, that meaningful action is only possible once conditions become favorable, once anxiety decreases, once uncertainty softens, once life becomes manageable enough to begin. Frankl's environment violently disproved this logic. Conditions did not improve first. Meaning was N. After enough avoidance, a person begins making a dangerous interpretive error. They stop viewing their hesitation as behavior. They begin interpreting it as identity. Not, I have been avoiding difficult things, but I am the kind of person who cannot handle difficult things. This distinction is psychologically devastating, because once behavior is translated into self-definition, the problem becomes harder to interrupt. Action now threatens not just discomfort, but identity coherence. Failure would confirm the feared narrative. Success would destabilize it. Albert Bandura's work directly challenged this architecture. In 1977, Bandura formalized the theory of self-efficacy, the belief in one's capacity to organize and execute actions required to manage prospective situations. This was not a theory about abstract confidence, not vague self-esteem, something far more behaviorally grounded. Perceived capability. Do I believe I can do what this situation requires? Bandura's research demonstrated that this belief strongly influences whether people initiate action, persist under difficulty, recover from setbacks, and tolerate challenge. But the most important finding was not that belief matters. It was how belief is built. Many people assume confidence precedes action. Bandura's work suggested something far less emotionally convenient. Belief is often downstream of experience, not manufactured first in thought, constructed through evidence. And among the sources Bandura identified, one stood above the rest. Mastery experiences, direct encounters in which a person successfully executes a task, especially under challenge. Not imagined success, not verbal reassurance, not motivational rhetoric, behavioral proof. Something reality can no longer deny. This matters because it reframes self-doubt. Your low confidence may not be evidence that you should wait longer. It may be the predictable result of insufficient contradictory evidence. Mastery experiences are deceptively small. This is what makes them easy to underestimate. A difficult phone call completed. A boundary finally communicated. A task initiated despite resistance. A decision made without waiting for perfect emotional certainty. These events may appear trivial externally. Psychologically, they are not. Each one functions as evidence, a data point inserted into the self-model. Before action, the internal narrative says, "I cannot handle this." After action, reality introduces contradiction. You did handle it, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps awkwardly, perhaps with elevated anxiety, but completion occurred. This is enough to begin destabilizing prior conclusions. Not through inspiration, through disconfirmation. Bandura emphasized that successful experiences are especially powerful because they directly alter perceived capability. The person is no longer reasoning hypothetically about what they might be able to do. They are referencing memory, something already survived, already executed, already real. This changes the internal dialogue. Future challenges are no longer evaluated from a position of pure speculation. There is precedent, evidence, behavioral history, a rewritten archive. This is why action matters disproportionately, not only because it changes outcomes, because it edits identity. Every completed act of tolerated difficulty becomes part of a new psychological record, and records accumulate. This is how self-perception changes, not through sudden revelation, but through evidence so repetitive that the old narrative becomes increasingly expensive to maintain. At some point, the identity built around incapacity begins running out of supporting documentation. This also explains why passivity is so corrosive. Inaction is not neutral. It is evidential. Every avoided opportunity quietly contributes to an opposing record. Not necessarily proof of incapacity in objective terms, but psychologically, that distinction matters less than repeated interpretation. The mind is constantly updating its model of what you are capable of based on observed behavior, not declared intention, not private aspiration. Observed behavior. What did you actually do when challenge appeared? Did you engage, withdraw, delay, negotiate, rationalize? This behavioral archive becomes psychologically authoritative over time, which means your self-concept is not built primarily from what you say about yourself. It is built from accumulated interaction history with difficulty. This is why repeated avoidance becomes identity poison. Not because each individual avoidance is catastrophic, because each one contributes incremental evidence toward a narrative of limitation. And narratives built from repeated evidence feel increasingly true, even when they began as behavioral accidents. This is the brutality and the opportunity. You are always training self-perception, intentionally or not. Every action votes. Every avoidance votes. Every tolerated discomfort votes. Every retreat votes. The archive is being written continuously. And eventually, the identity you experience as natural may simply be the sum of repeated behavioral ballots cast under discomfort. There is a cost to avoidance that is rarely measured correctly. Most people imagine the price is external. A missed opportunity, a delayed project, an uncomfortable conversation never had, a door that quietly closed. These are visible losses, easy to name, easy to mourn, but the deeper cost is usually invisible. Avoidance slowly alters the relationship you have with your own mind. Each retreat teaches observation. You were there, challenge appeared, and you did not move. The nervous system records this, not as a moral judgment, as data, a behavioral event with interpretive consequences. Over time, something subtle begins happening. The future starts feeling heavier, not necessarily because life became objectively harder, but because accumulated memory has changed the forecast. The next difficult action is no longer encountered in isolation. It arrives carrying history, evidence, a private archive of previous withdrawals. This is why repeated avoidance often feels like life is shrinking, because in a behavioral sense it is. The map of available action narrows, not through external prohibition, through internal contraction. more and more situations become psychologically coded as expensive, risky, identity-threatening, until eventually, the person is not merely avoiding isolated discomforts. They are organizing daily life around the minimization of internal friction. This can look stable from the outside, functional, reasonable, but psychologically it is often slow territorial surrender. A life increasingly designed not around expansion, but around controlled contact with fear. What makes this process dangerous is not merely what it removes. It is what it replaces. Avoidance rarely leaves an empty psychological space. It fills the space with explanation. Rationalizations emerge to protect coherence. This is not the right time. I need more clarity. I should wait until I feel certain. I'm not prepared enough. Later. Soon. After one more adjustment. One more improvement. One more sign. These explanations often feel intelligent, measured, responsible, and sometimes they are. But repeated often enough, they can become camouflage. Not for wisdom, for fear with better language. This is one of the mind's most elegant defensive maneuvers. It converts emotional avoidance into apparently rational delay. The person no longer experiences themselves as retreating. They experience themselves as planning, refining, preparing, optimizing. Meanwhile, behavior remains unchanged. No contact, no exposure, no evidence, only increasingly sophisticated reasons for why movement is still premature. This is how stagnation becomes difficult to detect. It stops looking like fear. It starts looking like strategy. And because the explanation feels coherent, the cost remains psychologically hidden. Months can pass this way. Years. Entire identities can form inside narratives built to make non-action feel intellectually justified. Not because the person lacks intelligence. Often because intelligence is being recruited into defense. Used not to move closer to reality, but to avoid the emotional consequences of entering it. There is another consequence people almost never anticipate. Avoidance does not only shape the present, quietly edits memory, not by deleting events, by altering narrative interpretation. A person begins reconstructing their past through the lens of accumulated hesitation. Moments once understood as isolated become recategorized as pattern. A conversation never initiated, a risk never taken, a truth never spoken, a boundary never enforced. At first, these appear disconnected, harmless, forgettable, but under repetition, the mind begins linking them. A storyline emerges, not from fiction, from consistency, and consistency is psychologically persuasive. This is how a human being can become convinced they have always been a certain way. Not because the identity was fixed from the beginning, because enough aligned evidence has been collected to make the pattern feel ancient. I've always been like this. This phrase is often less autobiographical truth than retrospective editing. A compressed interpretation built from repeated behavior. This matters because once the past feels narratively settled, the future begins feeling predetermined. Not logically, emotionally, a person mistakes familiarity for destiny. And this is one of avoidance's most corrosive effects. It does not merely influence what you do. It begins influencing what you believe has always been possible for someone like you. And yet the most uncomfortable truth may be simpler than all of this. Avoidance is seductive because it often works, at least temporarily. It reduces tension, restores immediate relief, creates the sensation of regained control. This is why it survives. Not because it is irrational, because in the short term it is often effective. It solves the immediate problem of emotional activation, but it solves it by borrowing against the future. Relief is purchased on psychological credit, and interest accumulates invisibly. A little more hesitation, a little less range, a little less trust in yourself, a little more dependence on ideal conditions, until eventually, the question is no longer whether fear exists. Fear will always exist. The real question is far more severe. Who is authoring the structure of your life? Deliberate contact with difficulty, or repeated negotiation with temporary relief? because a life is rarely destroyed in one dramatic collapse. More often, it is slowly redesigned by whatever principle is repeatedly obeyed. And in the end, identity is not built from what you admire, desire, understand, or intend. It is built from what you repeatedly serve.